Hey, how's it going everyone? This is YLAM here. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about shooting outdoors with the X-T3. This is something that's super challenging, and before we really get into it, I need to actually talk about how challenging it is, because dealing with this much light is something that's going to be very hard without some extra tools. So this is something that you'll definitely need. You're going to need an ND filter. I would recommend getting a variable ND filter in which you're going to be able to cut down a lot of light when there's full daylight out. I would definitely recommend one that can at least do 8 stops in terms of cutting down light. I definitely would recommend 6 to 8 stops if you just want to buy a fixed one. The reason why I say this is because without an ND filter, your camera is going to need a really high shutter speed in order to capture video. I'm talking somewhere in the 1/2000s, 1/3000s of a second, and that's just not going to capture very good video at all. In fact, it's going to be extremely problematic for you. So the first piece of gear that you're going to need is when you're shooting outdoors is definitely an ND filter, and like I said, I recommend 6 to 8 stops. Now, even with that piece of gear, I will say if you want to capture perfect video, in other words, a well-exposed videos without exposure stepping, without things that kind of make it look a little bit less professional, you're not going to be able to do it alone. A lot of times when you're indoors and you can control the lighting, you can be a one-man band and still really produce a high-quality professional video. But when it comes to shooting outdoors, you really can't do it without having a cameraman behind the camera keeping track of exposures. But if you want to do it by yourself, there are a couple of things that you can do to make your life a little bit easier, and it's still gonna turn out pretty well. Alright, so I'm out here in the sun right now. I'm with my 18 to 55. I have no ND filter, and basically I have it set to f2.8, and then I have the shutter speed set on auto, and I also have my ISO set on auto. And what you'll see is that as long as I stand in one spot, the camera probably does a pretty good job of making the camera will probably do a pretty good job of making the video look smooth. But as soon as I move around, as soon as I get into the sunlight, it's probably going to be a very different story, just because my shutter speed is so high. This is one of the things that you're really going to try to avoid, is if you actually don't have an ND filter and you want to film, you really need to actually stand still, because once you start moving around, that's when things get a little bit bad. Right now the sun is kind of out, and I'm just trying to show you what the difference is. I'm going to go into a more shaded area to see what it looks like. So this is what happens when you move into a more shaded area. Let's go ahead and head back, and we're going to go ahead and head into the sunlight again. Again, this is just me moving around like normal, and what you'll see is once we get into the sunlight, it's going to be quite harsh because of the high shutter speeds. Alright, so this is my recommended setting for basically anybody who wants to do outdoor video very easily, which is to set your camera into shutter priority. So I have my shutter speed set to 1/60 of a second because I'm shooting at 30 frames. If you want to shoot at 24, then you would go to 1/50 of a second. But generally speaking, that's not really going to bother anybody too much, that little small variance. But what this allows the camera to do is control the ISO and control the aperture, but I control the shutter, which is going to allow for a much smoother motion, which means when I'm moving around, what you should see is some smoother motion as I walk around. It's not going to be perfect, obviously, because we don't really have that much stabilization, but it's going to be a lot better than having nothing at all. So this is definitely my recommended settings. I'm going to go ahead, go into a shadow area, and you can see the light transitions. Now, because we are using photography lenses and a photography system, what you're going to see is probably a little bit of stepping of exposure, which means your exposure will just step down. It'll be noticeable, but for any type of run and gun shooting, you're just going to have to live with that. Limitation. But I feel like for somebody who wants to get up and going for video super quick, this is definitely the way to do it. Alright, so this is the last test, and this is with the camera on full auto. So auto aperture, auto shutter speed, auto ISO, and I still have the ND filter on, so I can really lower my shutter speeds, and it should look pretty smooth. Now, once you have the camera on full auto, what's going to happen is you might actually see stepping of exposure, but I guarantee you the camera is probably going to do a really good job of making the motion blur look very natural. The only problem is that because of these lenses and also because of how things work in the Fuji system right now. You might see a stepping of exposure when I go from the shadows out into the sunlight, but overall this should look fairly smooth in terms of motion blur and me just walking around. I'm gonna go ahead, head back into the shade again just to see if you actually see a difference. But I actually like shooting in this mode most of the time, mostly because it makes life very easy. So here I am facing right into the noon sun right now, and hopefully you will see a difference in terms of image quality between the three. So those are some basic suggestions that I recommend that you try. Really, when it comes to shooting outdoors, you really kind of have to go out there and play with it a little bit yourself and then find what you want and what you're comfortable with. This video is just designed to be a starting point to kind of guide you in the direction that's going to get you some really good video outdoors, but definitely play with it. Find your own path and make your own video style. Now, before ending this video, I do have a couple of suggestions for you. Number one, when you're actually setting your ND filter, if you have a variable ND, it's always good to err on the side of having too much than too little. Remember, our cameras have an extremely high ISO rating, so I go all the way up to 6500 on my X-T3. So if I actually have it overly dark on my ND filter, the ISO can go up quite a bit, but it's not true for the opposite direction. In other words, your camera can't really go below 160, and if you actually have too little ND filter to cut it out, once that light comes in, it's not going to be able to drop below 160, which is not a whole lot to actually work with. Then all of a sudden you're just going to have a completely blown out picture. So I would always caution you to err on the side of having too much ND rather than too little ND. Another suggestion that I would have for you is that if you're just starting out and you absolutely want to have a shot, just go ahead and set the camera on auto, set your ND filter to the max, and it'll still take care of you because we have that high ISO rating, and also because on full auto, the camera right now does a really good job exposing your picture and making sure that you have a usable video shot that you can use later on. It may not be perfect, but I guarantee you it's probably going to be very usable. That's all I have this week. If you're confused on anything or if you have suggestions or comments, please leave it in the comments below and I'll definitely look at them and answer you back.